Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Well, I am, through the miracle of technology, I am at my mother's house because today is her 94th birthday.
Should we sing?
No, it's okay. It's hard hearing, so she wouldn't hear us anyway. So, anyway, lots of intriguing things the past week. One thing that I think you and I are I'm interested in, and I know you are, is this whole business about the editing of Kamala Harris's interview on 60 Minutes. And, I have to say, well, folks out there listening to us right now, we do edit this podcast for well, number one, so that people sound better, and two, so we keep it within a reasonable time. But to me, a couple of things that make 60 Minutes, this case with 60 Minutes different, is that, you have to look at it in context. And Kamala Harris is known for her confusing, disconnected statements. And for the voter, this is material. As a leader of the free world and as president of the United States, this stuff matters. And, I am grateful when Tim edits out my ums, and I'm sure the listeners would be grateful too, are eternally grateful for Tim doing that. And again, I'm not running for office. The second issue to me is that, if there was ever a dispute about the editing, here at our podcast, gosh, we would send that raw material out as quickly as possible. Just takes a few buttons. Our editing usually just means lopping off a few lines in the end, a response that ran long. And I guess, I'm pretty sure that our guests are grateful for it. In fact, I often hear them humbly say, hope you guys can use some of this, which means that they already know that we're going to edit part of it. And finally, I think there's trust involved. And I believe that our guests trust that we are not going to manipulate what they say. And we've had a lot of people we disagree with on the podcast. We're a think tank. We believe in open sharing of ideas, open discussion. And, these days, no one seems to trust the media. And that's a big factor. What do you think, Tim?
That's right. I don't understand the hullabaloo about we're not going to release the unedited tape. We just saw in the last week, Bret Baier did a sit-down interview with Kamala Harris, got a lot of media attention. They mixed it up quite a bit. Yes, it was taped, but it was taped literally right before air. So, they didn't really have a chance to edit, but they aired the entire thing. And so I don't understand why, I've seen the comparison clips. I don't understand why, warts and all, you wouldn't release the whole thing. It would end the debate over this. And when 60 Minutes puts out a statement like it did last night, the charges of them putting their thumb on the scale for Harris, it's hard to defend them against that charge. Yes, Trump should sit down with 60 Minutes, no question. It's a tradition and an important thing that presidential candidates sit down and have these kind of long-form, tough grilling interviews. But I just don't see any justification for why they wouldn't release the entire transcript. We saw before, remember in 2020 when Trump did the famous sit down in the fall campaign with Leslie Stahl. Remember, he got up in the middle of it and left, and there was kind of an angry exchange. They aired that whole thing. Now, I don't know that it was unedited, but they certainly aired a lot of it and a lot of the behind the scenes moments. Well, why wouldn't you do the same thing here? Until we can see with our own eyes what happened there, well, it makes the regular viewer wonder, gee, was something said that you edited out? When you see the comparison of the two clips, yeah, it's pretty obvious they edited the clip to make her sound better.
And they really, as you say, ought to leave it to the viewer to watch it. A viewer may find that was a perfectly fair thing that they had done to make her sound better. But the fact that they were hemming and hawing about this all makes matters a lot worse. A lot of journalists think that PR people are on the dark side. But these days, maybe the journalists ought to listen to PR people now and then, because who knows, they might actually see the light and the merit of having to just provide all this information and let listeners decide.
That's right. What's the Washington Post slogan about, what is it, truth dies in darkness, something like that? I feel like that's what's happening here.
So let's talk about another issue that's important to us, and that's gas prices. Well, it looks like Californians can expect higher gas prices at the pump, thanks again to Newsom, who signed this bill that would require oil companies to hold a minimum reserve. So when prices go up, the theory is that this extra reserve will supposedly mitigate prices and keep them lower. This is just nonsense economics, Tim, and poor business practice. The idea of just-in-time inventory came out a couple of decades ago, maybe longer than that, and has been great for industry. Thanks to the technology, manufacturers can reduce inventories. It's helped businesses run more efficiently, keep prices down. You don't have to have a pile of stuff sitting in inventory when you don't need it. But this is what government is asking oil companies to do.
Well, what's also interesting with that proposal, our Wayne Weingarten did a little analysis of what the Newsom proposal alone would cost in terms of gas prices. And he estimated that depending on how much additional storage is actually required to be brought on, because it's not just renting somewhere. You got to bring this in, and in some cases construct it. It could be an additional 3 to 11 cents per gallon. But here you got government once again. Government's looking out for you, and what do you see? Phillips 66. As soon as the ink wasn't even dry on Gavin's signature, and they announced they're gonna shut down their facilities in Carson and Wilmington. That's about 8%, I read, of our gas supply that would be effective. So even when the state is trying to, quote, protect our gas supply and ensure there's a sufficient amount to prevent gas hikes, well, there you go. We're going to lose 8%, and that for sure, less supply is going to mean higher prices.
Well, just another interesting factor was that he actually got some pushback from Dems and even some of the union workers. What do you know about that?
Well, I mean, it's clear that the Newsom administration, even unlike the Brown administration that was very green, they've had a war on oil production. And if you look in Kern County, you look in Southern California, you look in the Bay Area at the various refineries, those are good, high-paying union jobs that they do not share. There is a big disconnect between kind of the operating engineers and the building trades unions and more of the, kind of blue-collar trade unions and A, the rest of the labor movement, but B, also politicians like Newsom. And when they push these kind of issues on low carbon fuel standard and storage and all of these, it's their jobs that are affected. And so when you have, Phillips 66, just for one example, them leaving, and they're going to leave sometime in 2025, that's 600 Phillips 66 workers that are affected and another 300 contractors, because there's a lot of other small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses that do contract work in oil production. And so now, not all of those people are going to lose their jobs, but maybe they might have to move to maintain their job. Maybe people might be pushed to have to retire earlier, and certainly some are going to lose their jobs. So it's simple bread and butter economics. This kind of war on California energy that Newsom is waging not only means higher prices for consumers, but it means lost jobs.
That's right. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more refineries and operators leave the state.
And then, of course, we have on the horizon, the California Air Resources Board are going to give us a little post-election surprise, and they're poised to adopt the latest version of the low carbon fuel standard. We've documented the impact of that one now. The one on the books is about 22 cents a gallon. It's estimated, and the estimates vary, and the bureaucrats at the California Air Resources Board push back on this, but of course, they don't operate with accountability or transparency to taxpayers. But it's estimated this will be another 47 cents a gallon. So if you think you're paying a lot for gas now, just wait till that's adopted. And it's pretty clear that's going to be adopted, though they won't, despite news media inquiries last week, they won't operate in greater transparency. But that'll be terrible. Imagine next summer, when we have the summer crush and, people are driving more and using more, add 47 cents a gallon on top of that. You could be regularly paying more than $6 a gallon. And the legislature tries to play hot potato. It's not us doing it. It's the Air Resources Board doing it. Well, they gave them the authority to do it. and they're not quick to take back that authority. And so you can't help but wonder, is this really what legislators want? They just don't want to get their fingers dirty with it.
Well, Tim, how about introducing our next guest?
So this week is a conversation, an extended version of a little video we put out a few weeks ago with Stephen Greenhut, our director of the Free Cities Center, and Judge Glock from the Manhattan Institute. And Judge is a well-known policy scholar. He writes a lot about issues related to housing and homelessness. And they have an extended discussion about all of these issues as related to California. And we thought, with housing being a key issue around California in the many legislative and congressional races and the local races, we're having a key debate certainly with Proposition 33 about rent control, that we thought that this more extended discussion about housing and to a degree homelessness, it's a very timely discussion as these issues take center stage in the final days of this year's campaign. So we hope you agree and find it a timely and interesting discussion.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment. But first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Hi, this is Stephen Greenhut. I'm the director of the Pacific Research Institute's Free Cities Center, where we look at great ideas to make cities better places. And I'm here with Judge Glock, who at the State Policy Network conference in Phoenix. SPN's the big annual gathering of think tank gurus and academics, and we try to put together interesting ideas. So, Judge, why don't you introduce yourself, and you're with the Manhattan Institute, and tell us a little bit about your book and your background.
Yeah, that's correct. So my name's Judge Glock. I'm Director of Research over at the Manhattan Institute. I was formerly a professor of economics at West Virginia University, focused on housing and mortgage policy. Wrote a scintillating, or scintillating, never quite know, book on the history of the mortgage market. And I do a lot of work today on issues around housing, finance, and homelessness in cities writ large.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us. And you had a really fascinating panel about housing today. And it's one of the interesting things but this is a free market gathering, is some of the free market politicians I've dealt with in California, like in Huntington Beach, is controlled by Republicans. And they are not in favor of free markets when it comes to housing. They do the NIMBY thing, the not in my backyard thing. They're trying to challenge different state laws that make it easier to build. So I'm wondering, why do you think some of the conservatives have lost their understanding of free markets, or maybe they never even had that understanding to lose?
Well, everyone's for free markets when it benefits them, and not necessarily for them when it doesn't. And but one of the things I've tried to do in the housing discussion is, although coming from a fundamentally free market stance, try to understand and appreciate the perspective of those people who do care about neighborhood character and protecting the certain environment they happen to live in or want to even develop if they're a developer. A lot of people on the left and the right consider municipal zoning or some other building regulations as something like a community property right. That they should be able to exercise some amount of control over, but it shouldn't necessarily be overturned by the state or by other actors. Now, I think this is often incorrect, but it is worth pointing out, and I have pointed this out to some advocates for free market housing, that many Americans today choose to join homeowners associations, co-ops, condos, or other organizations unanimously agreed to that have substantial amounts of control over the property and even aesthetic appearance of housing inside those developments. And that's clearly a demand. There is a demand by people to have some amount of control over their local environment in a semi-democratic process. Now, we'd like that to happen more through those sorts of unanimous agreements as opposed to municipal mandated zoning. But when we talk about limiting the damages of zoning, and they're real and substantial, we need to think about how can we accommodate those demands for some amount of local control.
We do want people to care about what goes on in their neighborhoods, but we also, I think they need to understand that you control your own property. But I like your point about the homeowners associations. I never liked those because it's just the one time my wife and I tried it, we lasted about a year and a half. We just couldn't take the
Well, for me, exactly. For me,
but
this seems like a nightmare, and I wouldn't want somebody telling me what to do with my mailbox or the color of my window shutters or whatever it is. But apparently, many Americans do like that, and this is part of the free market as well. They're choosing to join these organizations that do have substantial amount of control over their property, and they're choosing it freely. So that does leave out the question of, what about those people who are in existing neighborhoods that don't have those HOAs that accompany them? Again, we need to understand they want some amount of local control, but by the same time trying to convince them that you can't have complete blockages of development and you can't expropriate someone else's property rights and accrue the benefits to yourself without some sort of consequences.
Right. And the consequence in California has been that our home prices are just outrageous. I just saw the National Association of Realtors, their latest study showed that the median home price statewide in California, and that it means we're talking including places like Bakersfield, Fresno, inland places that have not traditionally been hot markets, is over $900,000. And in Orange County, it's like $1.5 million. And that's partly a consequence of this NIMBY-ism, right?
Yes, it's almost wholly a downstream consequence of NIMBY-ism and government regulations that are preventing the development of housing. In a largely free market for housing, you'd expect a housing unit to cost pretty much what it costs to construct. That can vary to some extent, but let's guesstimate it around $150 per square foot to $200 per square foot. Obviously, these $1.5 million houses in Orange County or elsewhere are many multiples of that, and that's a simple effect of restricting the amount of supply. Now, the question is what to do about it. There are these state level laws, some of which I've worked on, that are trying to mandate that the local governments allow more housing. Those are often very appropriate, and you need some sort of push to encourage more upzoning, as it's known, to allow that local development, even if you're not totally overturning local control. But one of the things I like to think about here are, what are the incentives that make certain governments either want to develop or not want to develop? Because in a sense, zoning is a necessary but not a sufficient explanation or cause for high housing prices. There are many areas in zoning, and many parts of America historically that had pretty low housing prices. If you look at America, the cost of houses was pretty close to the cost of construction, almost everywhere up until the 1980s or 1990s. So this is a pretty recent phenomenon, even though zoning goes back basically almost 100 years at this point.
And on your panel, someone, I forget who it was who mentioned that on the panel, that it started as kind of a racist thing, right?
Well, there were some aspects of this. There were some explicit racial zoning categories where, in the famous case of Buchanan v. Worley, the Supreme Court struck that down and said you cannot say there is a black part of town and a white part of town. And there has been the argument that regular zoning based on class or house size or et cetera,
Economic zoning
is to some extent a substitute for that. Now, I think that's to some extent true, and there's evidence that areas with more minorities occasionally have stricter zoning rules. But at the same time, I do point out to some people that states back in the 1920s and 30s with no pretense of a substantial minority population, places like Minnesota where the darkest person around was likely Danish, also adopted zoning. And so there was clearly this demand for it to happen. And again, that didn't seem to substantially affect housing prices really until very recently. And so that necessary condition was there, but the sufficient condition wasn't. And to my mind, we really need to think about, well, what are the incentives that make local governments want to develop more, and what do they not? What incentives make them not want to develop more? Because there's zoning in California as well as in Texas, in Dallas as well as in Los Angeles. What is different about Dallas's political situation from Los Angeles? And clearly, some of that has to do with everything like the fiscal incentives and some other reasons that people are more likely to want to build up in Texas.
Well, one issue. Well, first off, what might be an incentive is maybe a political incentive, just a belief in markets and progress and growth, as opposed to in California, there's just this political vibe against growth and against new residents, where Texas seems very welcoming.
Yeah, there's part of that. It is just a general ideological environment. But I think that itself is also not a sufficient explanation, because if you look at some of the ways that zoning is constrained in Texas versus California, I think one of the best ways it's done is the fact that Texas, it's fairly easy to grow outwards. And it's actually pretty easy to create not just competing developments, but competing cities that basically drive down what we could call the monopoly rents of existing cities. So let's say there's just like a monopoly in a private market, let's say there's one big monopolist that can prevent any new cities from growing, and they can reduce the amount of development and therefore increase the prices. If there's lots of different competing areas, you can actually reduce that benefit they could get. Because, hey, you reduce development here, and the development just goes down the road, and you get no benefits from it. So in Texas, you can form these things called municipal utility districts, or MUDs. They can basically create their own water and sewer and highways and pay for all this basically out of the property taxes of the new development as it grows. And that helps suppress that desire of local governments to prevent development, precisely because they don't get as much of the upside. You prevent it here, and it's just going to happen down the road. So I think partially we need to think about how to, just like we want more competition in the private sector, we want more competition in government.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
Well, I have a new booklet for PRI coming out about new cities and the effort to build new cities. And I look at all the many planned communities. Because there was a proposed new city in Solano County between Sacramento and San Francisco, and it was pulled from the ballot, and it should be coming back in 2 years, but obviously created a lot of controversy. But my argument was that we've been building new cities forever, and we should be experimenting with new cities. But I looked at Houston, which still doesn't have zoning, and the public always rejects proposals to impose zoning. But actually, Houston has a lot of master plan communities that have homeowners associations. So a large percentage of Houston residents choose to live in that kind of like the woodlands. They choose to live, and then people like us would probably move in town. Because if they build a high-rise behind my house, I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, get more friends around and more amenities, hopefully, that come with it.
But another point about Texas and some of those other markets and this whole idea of there being a desire in those communities to build more is, and you had talked earlier about your background in the mortgage, doing research on mortgages. During the 2008 bust, the housing bust, I had read some articles that had pinpointed growth controls to the degree that there was a bust, because in some communities, like in Texas, the market went down, but not nearly like it did in growth-controlled areas because the market was able to meet supply and demand, where in us growth-controlled areas, it just can't. There's too much of a backlog to build a new development. It takes 2 years to permit them. Does that ring true to you?
Oh, totally. If you look at housing prices across the U.S. in the lead up to 2008, we often think of this kind of chart that shows a big bump that peaks around 2006, 2007, and then starts to decline afterwards. But that was very city and state dependent. You did not see substantial price increases in much across the middle of the United States, precisely because they were largely unzoned, or minimally zoned, they allowed growth outward. As one would expect with your basic supply and demand sort of curve, quantity responded, not price. If you restrict the quantity, the price has to go up when you have a lot more of these government subsidies and increased demand for housing. If you don't restrict the quantity grows and the price stays pretty level. Now, post-2008, a lot of people said, oh, places like Phoenix, where we currently are, they overbuilt housing, and that was the real problem. And so even maybe growth controls would have limited the quote-unquote damage from that excessive overbuilding. But in reality, we know now prices are actually substantially higher than they ever were in the so-called peak of 2006. We didn't have an overbuilding problem. We had an underbuilding problem precisely in those areas that were really restricted. And the fact that we had a giant financial collapse merely caused a temporary decline in prices and increase in vacancies in a few of those largely free cities. But those were taken up after 2010 and onwards, and the recovery. And so, yeah, the actual price explosion was largely limited to these locally over-controlled areas.
Now, let's change gears. You had mentioned on the housing panel about permitting reform. Mm-hmm. Could you explain what that is and why it's such a good idea? It struck me as an extremely good idea.
It's something that I'm very excited about. So we've already discussed a little bit about the problems with local NIMBY-ism trying to block development and trying to encourage more of that or force more of that at the state level. Now, one of the reasons I like the idea of permitting reform is it actually sidesteps a lot of those issues. It says we're not actually going to talk about how much density you're going to have in your neighborhood because we know the sort of opposition that elicits. But we are going to talk about, hey, how do we make the actual permitting process for the existing codes, taking those existing building, electrical, etc. codes as given, how do we make that smoothly as possible so there's not just waste in that? And one way to do that is to allow independent parties, private providers, to do inspections, do government permit approvals, do document review, plan reviews, plat reviews, all of these things that have to go into the permitting of a house. And to some people, this sounds a little wild, but in fact, throughout large parts of the country, especially in smaller areas, it's already done. They don't have the manpower for a government-run permitting office. They just say, hey, you private providers, you do the inspection, you're liable if something goes wrong, you certify it with your own name and business on the line, and then we can check up on you afterwards. And that works largely well. It just doesn't often apply in those large cities that try to run it all outside their own office. So there's actually been some really positive reforms in Texas, Florida, Tennessee, and elsewhere that are allowing pretty much statewide people to go to these third-party permitters and get inspections quicker, get permits quicker, again, with no sort of debate about how much development we want as a whole, because these are things that are already allowed. We're just making sure they go through the process.
Well, yeah, I had a new insurance policy, and they just had me they went to contracted with a separate company, mm-hmm. and I downloaded the app and I did a video of the whole house, mm-hmm. and then they would send an inspector if they needed more. But there's no reason for a building inspection as long as the company doing it certifies. Yeah. And I did some remodeling in a small town where you go down to City Hall and they'll send Gus or Mac or whatever his name is right over that afternoon. It's not that big of a deal, yeah. But in some of the California cities, you've got to wait 2 months or 6 weeks or 4 weeks.
It can devastate the very possibility of these developments happening at all. If you have that, as to say, no business is time is money more true than in development, where you have high financing costs, where you have a lot of men and material you actually have on site. You have to pay whether or not these things are going through. And if you have to just sit there twiddling your thumbs while an electrical inspector from the city takes a week or plus to get over there, then yeah, that could make it less like you need to build it in the first place. So yeah, allowing these third parties to do it, very sensible. Again, already done in many other spheres. In some sense, it can be even more responsible than the government inspector doing it, because the government often immunizes itself against any liability. They say, hey, we do the inspection, but if it collapses afterwards because we missed something that has nothing to do with us, the private sector can say, no, we're holding ourselves accountable if something goes wrong. So far from like reducing the actual responsibility of builders and developers to meet these codes. If anything, it's increasing it, but it's doing it all a lot more rapidly and doing it with much less cost.
Sure. Once I went to a government, the planning department, and I was told one thing, and then we spent a lot of money based on that one thing we were told, and then that person no longer was there, and we went back, and they said, no, that was wrong. Sorry, you have to do it all this way, which cost a whole bunch of other money. There was no accountability.
No.
If it were a private company, I'd probably have some sort of recourse.
You go to the Better Business Bureau, or next time you're going to a different provider. You're saying, hey, that I was doing everything right, and I still got held up indefinitely. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that can happen, and I'm very optimistic that can spread beyond the basic states that have adopted it already.
Okay, and one last thing before we wrap up, we had discussed about some water issues, and I did a book for PRI called "Winning the Water War," so it always interests me. And you have been doing some research on water rates,
yeah,
and how that might promote conservation. Could you give a little bit of a rundown on?
Yeah, I'm looking at. I think one of the other aspects, kind of understudied aspects of the housing crisis in a lot of these major cities and states, is that you don't just need things to be legally allowed. You need the infrastructure to be there, and that is a difficult question if the government still has to provide the infrastructure in some way, shape, or form. How do you make them do that? Now, one solution is something like the MUDs that I talked about in Texas, where the private sector can actually just build this stuff out. The other sort of solution is to reorienting these existing water and sewer utilities, which are a massive part of local government. Actually, more is spent on water and sewer than on police or housing and transit combined. All of these things that we think of as major local government functions. But right now, water utilities and sewer see their job as limiting the consumption of water. They have basically an environmentalist mindset that we should prevent people from using too much of this. But historically, that wasn't the case. They saw their job as like an electrical company or anyone else. Let's maximize its consumption. But right now, part of limiting that resource, water and sewer, is preventing people from developing. Often you'll say, hey, we don't want to have pipes out to this new development precisely because that's going to draw down our water supplies, and we're worried about that, or we're worried about the sewer output into the local river, and rather than build to accommodate that, which can easily be done in many of these cases, they just say we'd rather prevent development. And that's precisely the wrong way to think about it. We need these local utilities either privatized or more on an orientation that thinks about growing the base of their product, which is water is literally one of the most renewable, reusable projects.
50% goes out to the Pacific.
Yeah, all of this flows out, as you know as well as anybody. This flows out all the time. There's plenty of it around, despite occasional hand-wringing by environmentalists.
And occasional droughts.
And occasional droughts.
You save more water when it's dry, and you use
it otherwise, and you can accommodate and make the facilities to do this.
But the important point I think you made, one of them, was that a lot of people use water as a growth control method. Yeah. So Santa Barbara for years wouldn't connect to the state water project because they didn't want the growth.
Yeah.
And after a grueling drought, I think it was in the 90s, they finally did. So you have to actually be out of water before they would. And I've even talked with conservatives who say, well, I'm all for more infrastructure, but we don't need more people or blah, blah, blah. So anybody does it.
Yeah.
And that's the impact of this on urbanism, is the fact that if you use water to limit, if you're just limiting water, you're limiting the ability to have more houses.
And everything else, everything that goes into a successful community. And we as participants in local governments, as society, should not be thinking about water as that way of this thing that we can use to squelch all possibilities of growth. Like, it should be the opposite. This should be that lifeblood of life that it's allowing things to develop. And the fact that's not happening, the fact that water prices and sewer prices are going up consistently for this natural product that's basically a commodity that's been in place now as a utility for hundreds of years at this point, is absurd. And hopefully, if we can reoriented those utilities and privatized so that we can get back to a more fruitful understanding of it.
Well, Judge, thank you for your time. Could you tell our viewers where they could read some of your articles?
Yeah, you can just look me up at Judge Glock at the Manhattan Institute, or you can do at Judge Glock at Twitter.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for watching.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.